David, this is an absolute pleasure. And I know you and I have had a couple of conversations and have a mutual interest in another country. But thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What brought you to Singapore of all places?
um, so my wife works for a tech company in Silicon Valley, a fairly big, what I would call a monstrous unicorn. I'm not going to name it, but a global fintech monster unicorn. So maybe I just named
it. There's only a handful of those.
Yeah, there really are. And so they were expanding their APAC presence, and she agreed to go do a year or two out in Singapore to help them build out. And so I gladly hopped on board and went along. It was at the end of a 4-year run for me in a nonprofit foundation as a GC. So it was a good time to check out. 4 years is and partly because of option, plans. 4 years seems to be a number in Silicon Valley that's a really comfortable, okay, I'm going to punch out and move on, or peace out, I should say, is probably the better phrase. Peace out and move on to the next thing. And moving on to the next thing is honestly one of the biggest blessings of working in Silicon Valley, because I know there are other places, other companies where, particularly if you're a lawyer, there's sort of a dim view taken of moving too much. But that's not the case in Silicon Valley. It just isn't. If you're good, you're supposed to move a lot. So anyway, we went to Singapore and I had a blast. We had a blast. She worked hard. It was very successful. And we got a lot of travel in because Singapore is very centrally located. You can go to a bunch of different places on very short flights. We went out there in August 2019, and so we had a solid 6 months before COVID came in. And curiously, I was scheduled, in fact, did get on a plane and come back to the States to teach in February 2020. And I taught my course at the d.school at Stanford, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more later. And it was the last day of the night before my last class that Stanford shut down because of COVID. And I had to do my last class online. And then I bought the first ticket out of town to Singapore because I had to leave anyway. But to be honest, because Singapore, I just knew in my gut was going to be much safer place to be to ride out COVID. And I didn't want to take the risk of getting shut out of going back because I'm an expat. So I rushed back to Singapore, did the last class online from Singapore, and then we went into COVID shutdown, which was very effective. I don't need to tell you that, Singapore did it as well as almost anybody in the world.
Yeah.
They had certain advantages. And they got through it and came back out the other end roughly in July 2020 and have been running fairly normally since then. Schools open, people out, restaurants open, et cetera, since July 2020. And so Singapore was a great experience. And what I tell anybody who's willing to listen is even if it's later in your career, if you get an opportunity to truly go live and immerse yourself in your job overseas, I think it's really a valuable experience. And I tell younger people, including students, that doing a year or two overseas is an incredible plus on your resume.
Yeah.
When people look at resumes, when I did it, when I was reading hundreds of resumes in hiring, I always took a close look at people who had spent some time overseas. There's just a lot of reasons why that makes a potential employee pretty attractive.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to get sent over there to Singapore when I was 25 and thought it was going to be 2 years. And then I got left on Gilligan's Island and was there for 6, now in Amsterdam for 4. And it's just, at some point it's just like, do you come back? But we'll see how it goes. But
that's funny you mentioned Amsterdam. I was looking at of all things, I looked at the Zoom invite and I saw the invite was in Amsterdam time. And I thought, wait a minute, I didn't know Boomer was in Amsterdam.
My hidden surprise here. There you go.
Yeah, boom, so to speak. So, I spent one of my favorite weeks of European travel in Amsterdam. The combination of really great weather
That's a
in the
rare one.
season when people come out, and you have to learn how to ride a bike quick, or you're going to be the bane of Dutch society. But once you learn, and they don't mess around with the rules of the road on bikes, that's for sure.
No, it's an art, and
Yeah.
it's definitely it's one of those things. It's a skill. I'm not sure I'll put it on my resume, but it's a skill that everybody should learn at some point.
Yeah, well, I guess, the takeaway there is pro tip: if you go even as a tourist to Amsterdam for a few days, you're going to get on a bike. Please make sure you know how to make sure you learn what the specific rules of riding a bike in Amsterdam or Utrecht are, because it'll make all the difference. It'll make all the difference.
It makes the city very easy to navigate. It could also make it very painful. But
literally painful.
yeah, exactly. So David, we're going to talk about negotiation today, and we're going to get into so many different things because I know you have a long history in this, but I wanted to give people a sense of that history because you mentioned you spent 4 years in a nonprofit, and 4 years is sort of this nice cadence in Silicon Valley, but you've also done quite a number of other things in your life, and I would just like to give everybody listening a little bit of a sense of that as well.
Yeah, I think that's good to do, because negotiation's a fairly personal and sort of individually specific art. And so for people who are going to, when I want to learn from an expert negotiator giving a talk, I do want to know from what background they come, because it influences the way that they view negotiation. So I started my legal career in Miami as a trial lawyer mostly in the downtown courthouse of Miami, Florida in the 80s. And it was a wild time.
That's a very interesting time to be in Miami.
It's a very interesting time to be in Miami. You actually do bump into Don Johnson and Philip Michael Thomas on the street, in restaurants, kicking around. It was kind of new and different for us in Miami because it was just becoming sort of the international city. In fact, they developed a phrase for Miami after a while in the 80s as the northernmost city of South America, which gives you a sense of really the milieu. So I learned to try jury trials and appeals in Miami. So my negotiation chops were begun in conflict resolution, in negotiating litigation. I didn't do criminal, just negotiating civil litigation, pretty much hardball civil litigation. After 10 years in Miami, I came back to the West Coast. I was born and raised in Seattle, so I knew I was coming back to the West Coast sooner or later. Went back to school, took another degree, was interested in going into professional academics, but instead went back to work for a variety of reasons in Silicon Valley, which was a different kind of practice. And very quickly, I'd say within 2 or 3 years, I ended up working as general counsel for a startup, an overfunded startup company in the boom era of 99, 2000, 2001. And from that point forward, have done serial GC jobs, I think 4 or 5 of them. For-profit companies, not-for-profit, public and private, and got a good mix of subject areas, mostly technology, a little bit of design, and then decided I was going to back into teaching, and which has always been part-time, but I put a lot of energy and attention into it. So I started teaching at Stanford Law School, negotiation at Stanford Law School, I'd say about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago now. And started teaching at the design school about 5 years ago by creating a course, blending negotiation and design thinking to explore new ways to think about negotiation.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot of ways we can go down this conversation, especially
Sure.
just in terms of that combination that you mentioned at the end
Yeah.
is fascinating to me, especially as somebody who both lives with a designer and has some experience with design thinking. But just so we kind of lay our parameters straight for everybody, when
Mm.
it comes to negotiation, you mentioned in our email exchange, we all know the basics, but I just want to make sure that people are clear
Yeah.
on just sort of what those basics are, because some people make their livings out of being quote unquote good negotiators, and obviously they need some foundations to that. And so, what are those foundations to good negotiation, or the basics, if you will?
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of come at that question. So I'll take one path, not necessarily in preference to another.
Hmm.
Um, the way I like to think about it is in the world of negotiation, I very roughly divide types of negotiation into conflict resolution in one bucket and deal making in another bucket.
Hmm.
Now, someone will say, oh, but conflict resolution is deal making. Conflict resolution, yes, ultimately ends up in an agreement, which you could call a deal. When I say deal making, I'm referring to companies or individuals who are arriving at an agreement, whether it's a partnership or strategic partnership, uh, acquisition, some sort of commercial, usually a commercial deal that ends up with them working together for a significant period of time.
Hmm.
That's what I mean by deal making, as opposed to conflict resolution, which is almost always not always, but almost always a one-off where the parties resolve their conflict, arrive at an agreement, a settlement of some sort, dismiss a case often, and go their separate ways because
Hmm.
they just they are not interested in being partners with one another for
Yeah.
obvious reasons. So
Hmm.
that's sort of the first division. Um, the second is related, which is uh, distributive, what we call distributive or integrative in the lingo, but basically a zero sum fixed pie negotiation,
Hmm.
which is usually, but not always, conflict resolution.
Hmm.
Um, it could be a buy sell. So if I'm buying your used car, every dollar I get you to concede is a dollar in my pocket, and vice versa. So that's a uh, a straight up purchase negotiation, oftentimes zero sum fixed pie, and a little bit more competitive to boot. That's a distributive negotiation where you're distributing a fixed set of assets, usually money. Integrative is a squishy term, but and broad. It refers to most any negotiation where there's a potential for the parties working together to create more value than might first appear to exist.
Hmm.
And by creating more value, they can then distribute that value between them in the process of doing the deal. Uh, and that is where you hear the all too common phrase of win-win. Both parties
Hmm.
do better than when they first started. So I think of zero sum or growing the pie negotiation. I think of conflict resolution, and I think of uh, deal making. And I don't necessarily put those in a 2x2 matrix, but those are the buckets. And the reason the buckets are important, and they're pretty obvious, don't get me wrong. The reason I think they're important is because how you proceed once you've identified which kind of negotiation you're in um, is driven by the type of negotiation you're in.
Hmm.
Uh, the next basic for me that I really teach pretty aggressively, and the book that I use for basic class, Richard Schell's book, Bargaining for Advantage,
Yeah.
uh, really drives this point home. Richard calls his style of teaching negotiation information-based bargaining.
Hmm.
Now, we all know knowledge is power, information, et cetera, is important. But when it comes down to the craft of negotiation, um, how you manage information is really where the extraordinarily good negotiators tend to surpass the merely mediocre negotiators.
Mm-hmm.
What do I mean by that? So we have a very simple phrase. It's going to sound simplistic, in fact, but it covers the point. And that phrase is give, guard, get. Give, guard, get. I tend to envision negotiation as sort of this, I visualize it as a sphere into which all of the information relevant to a negotiation does or could exist. Some information I'm going to put into that sphere myself. That's the information I want the other side to have because it helps my case. I'm going to put information, I'm going to give information to the other side. I'm going to do it somewhat strategically so it doesn't look like I'm just dumping. I want to mete it out in small increments, and usually do that by way of trading for information they're giving me. But both parties are going to give information to one another voluntarily because they believe it helps them.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's information that I want to get from the other side. There are holes in my understanding, and I need information from them. Sometimes the information I want to get, they'll give to me. Most of the time, they're going to guard it. And likewise, vice versa. There's information I have that I don't want to give up, and I'm going to guard that information. So where now we've talked about giving information and getting information, the real action is in each side's guarded information.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is where you take the next step and focus on skill in getting the other side, acquiring the information from the other side that they may not want to give up.
Mm-hmm.
And there's two ways sort of that this surfaces. One is there's information they have that they're ethically obligated to disclose, or they're committing fraud if they don't disclose it. And then there's information that they're ethically not required to disclose that they can withhold legally, but you might still be able to tease out of them if you persuade them that it's in their self-interest to part with that information. And sort of this narrow band in the middle of the information gathering process, getting more information from the other side that they don't want you to have versus how much you give, is where also another place where the really great negotiators succeed. And another basic that I always like, that there's a chart in Shell's book that speaks to speaking and listening. He did a study, or he speaks about a study that was done, and he found that the more expert negotiators spend a lot more time listening than they do speaking during a negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
And that speaks volumes in its own right. But where an expert negotiator really succeeds is when they're working against someone who's a little less experienced. The less experienced negotiator by default feels like they have to say a lot of words, make a lot of argument, talk a lot to try and bolster their position, present themselves as having a very strong position. And the downside to doing that is a really good expert negotiator will read that person like a deck of cards. And there will be so much information that will be gleaned from what that person chooses to say that listening is in itself, just listening is in itself a way to gather information that the other side inadvertently lets slide over the rail.
All right.
So I think that covers what I would consider to be, the 10-minute primer on the basics.
Well, thank you for all of that. And I think there's a number of different avenues that we can go down there. And just perhaps we can go through a couple of things, and just from personality wise, one of the last things you just mentioned was the art of being a good listener. Mm-hmm. And tangentially, some of the things that you said reminded me of like games of poker, where you start to be able to read some person.
Yeah.
What are some of those characteristics that good negotiators develop in terms of listening, but observing in these people? What if somebody is too verbose
Mhm.
and giving away too much information? Are there specific things that you're looking for in order to emphasize, or is it just sort of a matter of feel when you're in conversation with that person?
Um, well, I would say it starts with a matter of feel,
Hmm.
but if you can, uh, it segues from, this is interesting. It's this whole another area that I find fascinating about negotiation when I compare it to my work as a trial lawyer. Um, Most beginner or intermediate, let's say, negotiators come to a negotiation thinking that the communication in a negotiation is essentially the same as a conversation. It is not. And it is a categorical mistake to think that you're just going into a negotiation and you're going to have a conversation about the subject matter and somehow you're going to succeed as a negotiator. It's a very different, highly stylized kind of communication. I may drop the word conversation because it appears to be a conversation, and the really good negotiator will make it feel like it's just a conversation. Oh, hey, let's sit down, talk this out, see what's going on. I want to understand how you feel about this situation, and maybe we can work something out that'll be beneficial to both of us. That feels like a conversation, and it's a trap.
Hmm.
Uh, I remember I'm thinking of that Star Wars GIF in my mind every time I say that phrase. It's a trap. So, uh, the expert will almost lull the beginner to sleep with that kind of preface, but in fact, what they're trying to do is get the other side just simply to start talking.
Yeah.
And then as they start talking, if they show poor discipline in controlling the amount of information that they're letting out, then what the expert will do is one of two things, and this is going to segue into timing,
Hmm.
um, is they will do what I call juggle in silence, which is they'll take each nugget of information that they find new and useful that this other person is giving them, and they will sort of put it in their mental juggle, and they'll keep these 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 18 nuggets of information kind of up in the air, very much in the forefront of their mind. And there's a reason for that. So hold that thought. So they're juggling in their mind these pieces of information as they flow. And what they don't want to do, the expert, is interrupt the rhythm of the person who's disclosing information.
Yeah.
The old saying is, when your opponent's beating themselves, get out of the way. And some negotiators will tend to, when they hear the first or second nugget of new information, they'll go, "Oh, I'm going to pounce." Go, "Oh, what do you mean? I got you. You just admitted that thus and such." And then the other person freezes up and kind of comes back to consciousness and says, "Oh, excuse me."
You can curse here. Don't worry.
I can. "Oh shit, I just screwed up."
Yeah.
Right? And then they lock up, and you've lost that opportunity. You've basically broken their own self-destructive flow in the negotiation, as it were.
Hmm.
And so that's the benefit of juggling as much as possible while they're going. Sooner or later, they're going to stop, or they're going to come to their senses, or you're going to have to inquire. But then when you decide, well, let's say they've given me 8 pieces of information in the last 12 minutes, and I feel very lucky to have accumulated these. Which one of these 8 do I want to put out and take a deeper dive on now that so my response to you might be, well, it's interesting, about 5 minutes ago you said something about uh, the I'll just use an example from my world, uh, the prior art search that you did on this particular patent that you're telling me about, that you think is bulletproof, and you've got 6 applications going in a bunch of different countries, which is great. That's a real asset. But tell me a little bit more about that prior art search, because it sounded to me like you're not comfortable that it could survive challenge. And so then I pick one, just strategically, and take a deeper dive on it, and then try again, and basically try to iterate the process and get them to start opening up about this topic that they've now given me. And so I'm iterating themselves against themselves. It's something that trial lawyers do very effectively, usually on cross-examination, is that they get a witness they can trap a witness with a decision tree, a question tree. It's the same thing as a decision tree, except it's questions. You know which answer you're going to get. Yes, no, it takes you here. Yes, no, it takes you here. And then you can elicit a conclusion based on that tree. And then you can say, okay, now based on this conclusion, because you just admitted X, and then you can press them on X, which you didn't have before you began. And so your structure gets you to X on a cross exam. And in this instance, listening gets you to X. And then you have a nugget that you can work with and you can play with. And the idea of going back to the idea of juggling your nuggets, that sounds kind of weird. Juggling your modules.
Well, I was gonna say something like, "How do you choose your nuggets?" So that's gonna be.
Well, to be honest, in a negotiation, because you've prepared well enough in your negotiation, you know exactly what bits of information are gold. So we're juggling gold nuggets, and you pick one to talk about at that moment, which means by definition you're saving the others. And then the question is, how do you sequence the others in a way that is most advantageous to you? And this is the point where talking about negotiation theoretically or in a vacuum has to stop, and it requires a factual based context to be able to say, what you would do going forward from there. But it does tee up the notion of timing. I'm a big advocate of the idea that when you do or say something in a negotiation is often as important as what you do or say in the negotiation. Because too many young negotiators, lawyers in particular, who have prepared fully and they've got their arguments all laid out, when they go into a negotiation, the first thing they want to do is, I want to say my piece. I want to make my argument. I want to, particularly if my client is there, I want to show my client that I'm here and I'm going to make their case like we were in the courtroom.
And that I prepared, right?
And that I prepared, and I am prepared, and I'm going to make the other side sit and listen to our argument, to our opening statement. And by doing that, I'm going to change their mind. That is a beginner's mistake. It's a rookie mistake. Is that just
100% the wrong thing to do? Right.
90% of the time, it would be the wrong thing to do. Okay. Some contexts you might want to do that, but it would be, you'd have to make a conscious strategic decision that that's the way you're going to go. But generally speaking, you can deploy that argument across an entire day or 2 or 3 days of negotiation. There's no reason to start and just use the first half hour of the negotiation to deploy that argument. Your argument probably will improve across 2 or 3 days if you engage in the information exchange part first and get more information, because then what you're looking for is information that supports your argument. There's nothing more persuasive in the courtroom, and every trial lawyer will tell you this. There is nothing more persuasive in any courtroom, criminal or civil, than a statement from the opponent that fits your argument and helps your argument. Because it is, well, it's obvious whether it's a judge or a jury, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, his argument incorporates the story he's telling, incorporates admissions and statements and evidence from the other side. It's much more muscular in its appearance of truth than if it's just something I have crafted as an argument or a story. I'll stop there for a second.
I think you're going on a very good point here around timing and just what I want to get into a little bit to that overplaying component of it. And some of the things that you've mentioned to me in our email exchange is let's take, and I want to define overplaying a little bit here too. So if I overplay as your opponent, and let's say we're sitting across the table together, is an overplaying giving you too much information? Is an overplay uh, is an overplay just sort of demanding too much of you, or just sitting down and laying out the arguments all up front? Is that an overplay in that case, or what exactly would an overplay be?
I think overplay is more mental than it is physical, which is to say, if somebody comes in and is loud and boisterous and competitive and argumentative, that to me isn't necessarily overplaying. I
Hmm.
don't personally like that style, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're overplaying. Overplaying is extending your position beyond uh, what it can support.
Hmm.
Uh, the classic analogy is going too far out on the branch of the tree. Uh, your argument has a certain amount of weight, but the more you extend it out the branch, the less support it has. The sooner or later, it's going to break the branch and fall to the ground. So I've got I'll tell a story without disclosing company names that to me is an example of several aspects of,
Hmm.
in the fire negotiations. Um, so years ago, uh, and some of this is public information, so and none of it is attorney-client privilege. Years ago, I represented a large pharmaceutical and medical device distribution company that had done a deal with a small medical device company, a startup in Silicon Valley. And they did a major contract, 10-year distribution agreement, lots of investment. It was a real partnership. And
Hmm.
everything went fine until the product didn't sell. It just didn't sell for a variety of reasons. And uh, we severed the agreement because certain representations about the product had not been met. And the other side sued us. So for a lot of money. So accelerate to just after the litigation had been filed and parties are starting to line up discovery, the parties agree to meet to have a negotiation to see if they can resolve this. And curiously, this was the first time this had happened to me. I know it happens a lot. One company's on the East Coast of the US, one's on the West Coast of the US. So they decide all the principals are going to hop on a plane and fly out to Chicago,
Of
to
course.
O'Hare
Right.
Airport.
Yeah.
And unbeknownst to me, that's where, I don't know which hotel chain it is, but one major hotel has their hotel in O'Hare Airport. And they have, it's really interesting, something on the order of 50 or 60 conference rooms in the
How
hotel
many
room.
deals get done there a year?
Yes, exactly. And uh, they have automated electronic signage in all the conference rooms. And you can just reserve a main conference room, you reserve breakout rooms, the whole 9 yards. And you just come in, you stay at the hotel, you do your negotiations, and then you part ways. And so in that way, it was really convenient. So we all got together and met for the first night of what was supposed to be 2 or maybe 3 days worth of negotiation. Now, interestingly, the other side's lawyer called us up, I don't know, 2 or 3 days before the meeting and said, actually, it wasn't the lawyer, it was the president of the company called us up and said, our lawyer is going to make a presentation. Then the night we get there, we have a 2-hour meeting. Our lawyer is going to make a presentation. We think your lawyer should come make a presentation. And I was that lawyer for the defendant. And I told my boss, I said, no. They go, what? Why not? I said, they've been working on this presentation for 2 months. And they're the ones who asked for this meeting. They are trying to corner us into a substandard product with insufficient information and
Hmm.
try and create an asymmetrical appearance of basically 2 opening statements at trial. But they have this enormous advantage. The way that we counter that is to refuse to do the statement, and we're not going to say why, and we're going to sit there and listen, very politely and listen to what they have to say. And we are going to ask no questions. And I said this very clearly, and just, young lawyer saying to president, general counsel, VP of sales of a major company, you are not going to ask any questions. You're going to, no matter what they say, you're going to show no reaction. You're going to nod, say, thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Mm-hmm. And so the trial lawyer, a really brand name, nationally known intellectual property trial lawyer, comes in. Sure enough, he does this dog and pony show. And we're watching the slides and we're watching the talk, and he presents a case and closes with a demand for, if I remember correctly, compensatory plus some punitive damages in the amount of, I want to say $2.5 billion, which was wildly out of proportion of what this deal was really all about. And I could see my guys getting really nervous and getting very angry, but to their credit, they did exactly what they were supposed to. And then we had a meeting after everybody broke. We had a meeting and they said, okay, well, what are we going to do tomorrow? I said, I'll tell you tomorrow morning. I was sweating bullets, but I went back to the room and I just strategized, and I realized that they had overplayed their hand. And I did a little research on the internet. I came up with my strategy. We went back in the next morning and I said, guys, they're asking for 1.2, 1.4. That is coming to me. I think it was about 1.4 billion in damages for our breaching a contract with them. I went online last night. This is a public company that's trading on the pink sheets at 98 cents per share. And I looked at their latest 10K, and they list assets, 37 patents or so. Some of them they own, some of them had exclusive licenses, all of which are transferable. And I argue, I ballparked the value of those patents. And I did some back of the envelope math. And I said to the president of the company, I said, you could probably go onto the market and buy this company somewhere between 15 and $20 million and own the assets of the company, lock, stock, and barrel, and whatever pension plan they might have, and terminate everybody, take the assets, and kill the litigation. I said, I'm not suggesting you should do that, but this now prices the deal. And because they have overreached so egregiously, this is a story we could also tell the jury about what the real value of this company is and how can the damages for litigation exceed the value of the company. And so he got all excited. He goes, this is great stuff. Let me go in there and talk to the other side right now. I said, no. You're going to go have a one-on-one meeting with the president of the plaintiff's company, but you're not going to do it first thing in the morning. I want you to go in there and play dumb and let him extend and adopt and extend the president adopt and extend the argument that his lawyer made all through the morning session. Break for lunch, go back after lunch, and then you drop the bomb on him. He played it exactly that way. So we had these guys extended out on the branch, but that was the lawyer speaking. If my guy went in the first thing in the morning, then the president says, well, that's my lawyer speaking. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm going to fire him as soon as he hears the argument and realizes the trouble he's in. So we then let the president of the company also go out on the branch with the theory and attach himself to that theory. And cognitive bias tells us that when people make an argument publicly, meaning to someone, some other person, or to the world, they are biased to defend that position rather than admit they're wrong.
Sunk cost fallacy, right?
Sorry?
It's like the sunk cost fallacy. You've already made
Yes.
it, so you're just gonna
Yeah.
fall forward
It's,
again. Yeah.
it's, that's just sunk cost is the same cognitive bias.
Hmm.
And so I wanted to get the president, the decision maker on the litigation, all completely bought in as well. So when after lunch, the president went in, our guy went in and spent about an hour and a half, and they came out and and they said, "Okay, we're done." The other guy, uh, looked like, I don't know, Casey at the bat walking away from the plate.
Hmm.
But we reconvened at about 4 that afternoon, and they had reached a settlement for something like 0.04% of their demand to make the case go away. And we all met again at the conference table, and uh, let's face it, I'm telling you a story where I was central to the victory. But the reason the story to me is so powerful is I didn't have a clue going in to that evening session the night before what was going to happen or what my leverage would ultimately become. But the leverage came from the other side's overplay.
Hmm.
Then, once I saw that, it became a matter of timing things in a way where the new information would have optimal value. In pick your sport, in tennis, it's well known that there are certain points that are more valuable than others. And the
Hmm.
most valuable point in tennis, by the way, and this is told to me by Billie Jean King herself, I assume it's still true in the modern game. Sorry, Billie, um, is the point before break point. If the most valuable thing you can do is break your opponent's serve. That's how you
Hmm.
win matches. The way you break opponent's serve is to get a break point, but you have to earn the break point to get to break point. So the point that gets you to a break point is the most valuable point in tennis. And uh, so you have to do things differently when you're in that point because of the weight that's on winning that point. Same thing with a baseball pitcher who has a strikeout pitch.
Hmm.
You can't show the strikeout pitch. It doesn't have any value to you until you have two strikes on. Then when you have two strikes on, your strikeout pitch, the valuation of that pitch goes up 1,000%.
Hmm.
And so it's a matter of timing. You could be the third pitch. It could be the 12th pitch of the at bat before you can pull that one out of your pocket and have it play. That takes me back to you're juggling silently, for lack of a better phrase, these nuggets of gold or your strikeout pitches. And you're waiting for the right optimal time to throw that pitch. And that makes all the difference in negotiation because ultimately negotiation is psychological war.
Hmm.
And when you inflict the fatal blow psychologically on your counterparty, it's game over, even if they don't yet know it.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. I want to go on to the psychological war component. And
All right.
I think, David, if it's okay with you, I want to spend just sort of our remaining time together looking at both from a business perspective, but also from a personal perspective, because obviously there's negotiations in everyday life, conflict resolution being one of the ones that you alluded to earlier. Let's go down the business route first, because there's a lot of people listening to this podcast that are business owners.
Yeah.
Tech companies, but also, uh, in finance, etc. In a negotiation in regards to business, and just bringing up the one that you just alluded to, uh, the roles that the roles that various people play, whether it be your general counsel. Can we just go through sort of the role of the general counsel, possibly the role of the executive within a negotiation? Because I imagine that there are a couple of entrepreneurs here saying like, hey, I could do the negotiation myself. Um, but what are the importance of those people, and why can't we just hire somebody from external counsel, for
Hmm.
instance?
So a lot of good questions there. So
Yeah, I just layered them on you. There. So,
yeah, yeah. So let's just define a fictional C-suite for the moment, of no such thing as an average company, but the average size company. So you've got, let's say, 4 people in the C-suite, at least, maybe 5: CEO, COO, CTO, CFO. I'll throw in a GC, and that's a pretty small cadre. It's possible that the best negotiator in that group could be any one of those players. An experienced GC should be in contention for being one of the best negotiators, but that's not always the case. And sometimes you have a young GC who's really good with the law, but may not be your best negotiator. I definitively prefer not having the CEO be the lead negotiator, because you want, not even if they are the best negotiator, because you want them to be the authority figure so that they are distanced from the person doing the speaking, so they can countermand, supersede, or change with their authority something that somebody else said. But if the CEO says it at the table, it gains the patina of being binding when it comes out of the mouth of the CEO. Gotcha. That's why you don't want the CEO, even if they're brilliant. I think that's just a good rule of thumb to have. So in an instance where you don't have a shining negotiator in your C-suite, you might want to hire a very senior, experienced outside lawyer to be the lead negotiator, particularly if it's going to be a tough one, because they get to play bad cop a little bit more, and they don't, by being an outside lawyer attached to XYZ law firm, they can be tough, but when the deal is done, they're out of the picture, and the damage has not really landed on the parties per se. If it's the VP, the chief technology officer, who's playing a very aggressive hardball role in the negotiation, after a deal is done, and the CTO then has to spend the next year in meetings with the counterparty's CTO, and he was a jerk in the negotiation, that negative is going to flow through the deal. It's going to flow through, if it's an acquisition, it's going to flow through the integration. So sometimes bringing an outside negotiator in tough negotiations is the right move. And oftentimes outside counsel is the right person. The reason I hesitate away from that is, we had a saying I was taught as a trial lawyer that if it's at all possible, the way you win a trial is by having one lawyer, the trial lawyer, have the entire case in one head. Big cases oftentimes get split out across 4 or 5 lawyers. And one lawyer will handle this subject area, one lawyer will handle the experts, one lawyer will handle the fact witnesses, lead counsel will handle opening and closing and objections, et cetera, et cetera. But when you break it up, you naturally distribute the knowledge, and things can get missed. When it's all in one mind, it's harder to do it. But when it's all in one mind, whether it's a trial lawyer or a negotiator, then you can see how things fit in other places in the deal structure. And outside counsel is at a serious disadvantage in that regard, because they don't live and breathe the business for years on end. They come in and then they come out. And so the reason I favor having somebody out of the C-suite negotiate a major deal is for that reason, is they have a deeper understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the company and its business and its people, and also at the detail level, the strengths and weaknesses of their arguments in this particular negotiation, the pluses and minuses of the deal points. And so inside the C-suite, it could be any number. It could even be 2 people are going to be negotiating as a team, although there should always be one lead and one second. But the primary reason I like having the lawyer do it, aside from sort of my obvious bias of being the general counsel myself, is it in a way, it relieves all of the chief officers of the burden of having to be nice or be conciliatory in a negotiation. It protects their reputation. So when the deal is done and integration begins,
Yeah.
they are not tainted by, because everybody can just say, oh, that's our asshole lawyer. You just got to understand, he's the devil, but he's our devil. So, look, just ignore him. We'll keep him out of the room as we go forward and do this, do this great flying car project or something. So I believe strongly that GC should be senior enough. GC, in-house counsel, should be in the C-suite team, but they have a different kind of a role to play. And one additional thing is they should know the law specific to the deal and the subject matter, and so every deal has legal components to it. And so better to have that person involved in the negotiation because of the legalities. And particularly if the counterparty is putting their lawyer up front to negotiate in a deal, you don't want to put a non-lawyer opposite them, because the first thing the lawyer do is start flexing their legal muscles, whether it's true or not. You've given them an inherent knowledge advantage to bamboozle or confuse or get a psychological advantage over the non-lawyer. So if you're going to do non-lawyer negotiation, lead negotiator, make sure if you're going to put your CTO up as the lead negotiator, make sure they're going up against a non-lawyer. Insist on it, that it be the CTO on the other side or the equivalent. And the other thing is, if the companies are relatively equal size, the negotiators should be of equal seniority. Don't let your CEO go in and then find, Apple was famous for this, sending in a medium level VP to negotiate with the CEO of a vendor. It creates a terrible playing field at the table.
So kind of double click on that, because it's just kind of interesting that you bring up Apple, and I've certainly heard of these kind of case studies. And as a lover of game theory, I'm just kind of looking at it and saying, okay, is Apple doing this because they're cocky? Or are they doing it to say like, hey, vendor, we can replace you at any given time? What is the angle there from Apple? And I can see how it would piss off a CEO, certainly. And I imagine you can probably transport that to like Walmart as well too.
Yeah. So I need to be fair to Apple. I mentioned Apple there just because it was first to mind, because a friend of mine who used to be the GC at Intuit, I'm sorry, at Intel, did I say Intuit? The GC at Intel told a story of how he had negotiated opposite Apple, and Apple has a reputation for negotiating very, very tough. And that came from Steve. Steve managed the negotiation team from behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And it was very carefully orchestrated, and it was very hard ass. And it was in furtherance, I think, personally, the way I read the story, it was in furtherance of Steve's belief in brand includes reputation.
Yeah.
And so the way the story was told to me is Steve was the closer. He would come into the room when the parties got stuck, and the parties would get stuck because he instructed them to get stuck. And then Steve would come in and use his, famous force field, reality distortion field, I think they used to call it.
Yeah, that's what Walter Isaacson called it in the biography, right?
I've never experienced it, but my friend from Intel said it's true. He was in the room. He said it is undeniably true, and it's amazing to watch. And he comes in and it's these aren't the droids you're looking for kind of forced, and the deal gets done. So that's how Apple does it that's the only reason I pick on Apple here at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was in a small startup in my first GC job, we always talked about dealing with the 800-pound gorilla. The 800-pound gorilla could be, like you said, Walmart, could be Apple, could be, this is before Facebook or Google. For us, it was DoubleClick was the 800-pound gorilla. But there is a different strategy to take with the 800-pound gorilla. They will always make you believe that there's a bunch of other vendors that they could just as easily go to as you. But that's almost never true. If they're at the table with you, if the 800-pound gorilla is at the table with you, there must be something that they want. I'd say 10% of the time they're using you as a stalking horse when they intend to do a deal with somebody else. But 90% of the time they're interested in something that you have that fits a lacuna in their system, but they're not going to tell you that. But you have to assume that if they're at the table, then there must be something they want and that you have that others don't. So this, going back to the basics, is the difference between power and leverage. And I like this little story about the difference between power and leverage because everybody understands it. And this story, I think, is in Shell's book also, but I'm sure preceded Shell's book, which is, imagine yourself home at night at the dinner table and you're trying to get your 6-year-old daughter to eat her vegetables. She doesn't want to eat her vegetables. And you want her to eat her vegetables. Now, in this scenario, power is the power of the parent over the child, not just physical strength. I mean, that's the least of it. The power of putting a roof over the head, educating, feeding, clothing, protecting the child. All of the power is with the parent. What the child has in refusing to eat the vegetables is leverage. By holding out and not eating the vegetables, the child's leverage increases to a point till they get sent to their room. It increases to a point. That's leverage. And curiously, the more the parent insists on the child eating their vegetables, the more that leverage goes up. And so usually the child will cut a deal. I get dessert or an extra half-hour TV time. And the parent will say, yeah, if you eat the vegetables, swoop, the vegetables are gone, and child won the negotiation. But that, to me, is the distinction between power and leverage. So when you're a small company dealing with 800-pound gorilla, the thing to remember is they have the power, but you can create leverage. And the more reticence you show, which is unusual to show to a company of power, you can tease out how much they really want what you have. And the more they show their hand about how much they want what you have, the more leverage you have, and the more you can level the playing field with respect to the deal terms. Now, sometimes you just can't develop leverage. Sometimes, as the small guy, you just have to take the deal that's offered to you. Yeah. If you're a new product and you want to get on the shelves of Walmart, you just take the deal and you hope that your product speaks to the customer, and that's where you gain your leverage for the next negotiation. So I went off track there a little bit. So why don't you reel me in and take me where you wanted me to go?
Well, David, that was fascinating. And so I want to just kind of, because we're coming up here on time, and I want to, before, and I know that you and I are going to have multiple conversations in the future because we didn't even get to design thinking in its relation to this. But when it comes to things like conflict resolution and it just sort of the personal element of negotiation, what are basic tips that, or not even basic tips, but like things that people should be doing better in negotiations? Because conflict resolution happens everywhere. For instance, relationships, whatever it is. What are sort of the elements that you kind of witness either walking down the street or with your students, et cetera, that you say like, hey, we should be doing this differently?
Yeah. So specific to conflict resolution, and let's, generally speaking, stay in the personal realm.
Mm-hmm.
I would say preparation. There doesn't have to be, it's not the same kind of preparation you would do for a commercial negotiation, but preparation in the sense of really thinking about the issue that you want to address. There's a really good book, by the way, by Sheila Heen, Heen, called Difficult Conversations. Has almost entirely to do with managing difficult conversations in the personal context. And I would add, in addition to thinking about the issue, the difficulty of a conversation that you plan to have, which will be conflict resolution, but sometimes I like to think of them as difficult conversations because it takes the conflict piece out of it. It focuses on the communication. Really challenging yourself to think from a 360-degree perspective, the issues at hand. And that means viewing it from your own point of view, which is sort of the default assumption for every one of us. We think about it from our own point of view first, and then really exercise your empathy to see it from your counterparty's side. So if I'm going to have a difficult conversation with my wife, for example, I try really hard to see it through her eyes, even if I don't agree with the words that she had said or the position that she took. I still try and absorb as best as I can how she sees the world. Not necessarily because I'm going to convince myself to agree with her, but that gives me the opportunity to shape what I'm going to say in a way that it fits better with her view of the world, lock and key kind of concept.
Mm-hmm.
And then here we go to timing. I can't emphasize it enough. Pick the right time to have the conversation. And oftentimes that's not a particular time of day or the week. Oftentimes it's a read of your counterparty's emotional state and whether or not they're prepared to have the conversation, to hear what you have to say. And then thirdly, this is another whole area that I talk a lot about in class. And I've become more and more every day almost aware of. And once you start thinking in these terms, it becomes very apparent. Word choice. Most of us speak in day-to-day conversation off the cuff quickly, and we're not consciously choosing our words. We kind of use words that we are used to, that we're comfortable with, that nobody seems to be terribly offended with. So we use a basic vocabulary, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying you got to go get esoteric words. No, that's not what I'm saying. But just certain words can trigger positive reaction and other words can trigger negative reaction. And in the midst of a difficult conversation, remember, just like the tennis, the most important tennis point, sometimes these key words, these trigger words have such outsized importance in a difficult conversation that choosing which word to use makes all the difference in getting the communication, the conversation to move forward on a path of resolution than allowing it to get distracted or sideswiped by somebody taking umbrage at some word that I used. And it can be a pretty simple word. I'm not thinking of an example right now, but every one of us can think of an example where we said something to a significant other or a spouse. I go, oh man, I wish I hadn't used that word. That just, and
I
it's
mean,
not a
even
swear.
choice of pronouns, right? Like
Yeah.
simple things like that can really
Yeah.
just piss people off.
Yeah. And so I tend to, you probably already noticed, I tend to have hesitance in my speaking, and that's a little bit of a bad habit, but it also is a habit that I learned because it gives me an opportunity to be somewhat conscious, somewhat deliberate about the words that I want to use in the next phrase, the next sentence. In negotiation, it works really well. And in trials, it works really well. I started trying cases in the day when court reporters took down, and they still do, took down the words verbatim on paper. So a pause doesn't really show up. So I can stop in the middle of the sentence and then keep going, having chosen my words carefully, but it just reads as a simple sentence. And, that's the skill trial lawyers learn, how to speak written English. How to speak written English is, and sometimes it's why we sound stilted, because we're basically dictating complete sentences for the paper as opposed to having an oral conversation with friends. But I digress. So I think the real takeaway in a nutshell for difficult conversations with family and friends is empathy for the other side's point of view. However, you may not agree with it, at least empathize so you understand it. Shape your overall strategic statement to fit their understanding of the world. Don't necessarily ask them to abandon their understanding of the world. But at the same time, explain your understanding of the world and invite them to explain their understanding of the world in a kind, and I can't emphasize this, is how I start every class in negotiation since I started. The rules are kindness and honesty. We're going to be honest with one another in our communication, but we're going to be kind in doing so. And to me, that gets you 85, 90% of the way to avoiding mistakes in having a difficult conversation. And I think mistakes are the biggest problem in difficult conversations, not the subject matter of the conversation itself, but the mistakes that get made in trying to have the difficult conversation, which sends it off the rails because the tensions are already so high.
Brilliant. David, this is fascinating. I want to wrap things up with just a final couple of questions.
Sure.
Think of these as rapid fire.
All right.
What's your top trick for enhancing your focus?
For enhancing my focus? The way I think about it is heightened awareness. I want, in instances where I want to heighten my awareness, normally what I do, and I do this for sports as well when I'm trying to get in the zone, because it's basically the same thing. I try to, wherever I am physically, I try to shut out the noise. And it may be noise inside my head. One of the advantages of learning how to meditate a little bit is that you can, on command, shut down the inner voice, because that's the biggest obstacle to allowing your mind to do what it does so well, and achieve heightened awareness. And I kind of amplify, that's probably not the right word, I focus on my ears, because like when you go stand in the woods and you want to listen and you quiet your mind and focus on what you're hearing, sometimes closing your eyes, you'll start to realize there are things you can hear in the woods that you wouldn't hear if you were just walking down the trail thinking about yesterday's crazy stress. So when I need to achieve heightened awareness, it's quiet the mind and listen carefully.
Beautiful. Book which has most impacted your life?
I'm going to go way back. There's a lot of them, but I'm going to go way back because it jumps to mind. I can't help it. It's called The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse.
He's famous for, is it Siddhartha?
He is famous for Siddhartha, yeah. But Glass Bead Game was one that really affected me when I was younger. And, it's been a long time since I read it, but basically it's the narrative fictional story that exists solely for the purpose of explaining a philosophy of life that is a blend of calm emotion, high intellect, and sort of like a Buddhist, Taoist peace in the world.
Mm, beautiful.
Yeah.
Where can people find out more about you, David?
I have a bio on the Stanford faculty directory page. It's an easy Google search.
Mm-hmm.
I'm up on LinkedIn. If you want to see what I'm saying at any given moment, you can go to Twitter and chase me down. It's just Johnson at Johnson _ David W, because it's a very common name. And I'll probably be saying something sharp about the politics of the day. But I am in the process of writing a book on climate issues and design thinking as applied to climate issues. So I'm going to start spending my time on Twitter, at least, and probably also LinkedIn, focusing on design thinking and climate activism for the next year or so.
Well, you've just kind of hinted at what our next conversation is going to be about. So, David, thank you so much for taking the time today. This is absolutely enlightening, and I can't wait to have you back.
I appreciate. I really enjoyed it. You asked great questions, and I feel simpatico with your sort of demeanor and your calm, all the way on the other side of the world in Amsterdam. So I appreciate the way you managed it and the way you ran it, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Excellent. To all the superhumans listening out there, have an epic day.